The winter of 1939 settled over Germany with a quiet that felt unnaturally heavy, as if the cold itself understood what was coming. Cities glowed with the familiar mix of factory smoke and candle-lit windows. Families huddled together under the strain of rationing, and soldiers marched across frozen streets toward a war that was still in its opening act. But behind the public rallies and polished speeches, behind the patriotic songs broadcast through radios in every home, another kind of operation was beginning, one that did not involve battles, borders, or armies. It began in whispers, in sealed letters, in secret meetings. And before long it would drag the medical profession into one of the darkest chapters of human history. The roots of the T4 Euthanasia Program did not appear suddenly. They grew over decades, seeded in ideas that German society had been wrestling with long before Hitler's rise. By the early 20th century, certain intellectual circles had become infatuated with eugenics, the belief that human populations could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. It was a concept that gained traction far beyond Germany. American universities, British thinkers, and Scandinavian governments all entertained similar ideas. But in Germany, devastated by World War I and the economic hardships that followed, these theories found especially fertile ground. They promised a way to rebuild strength, purity, and national vitality. They offered solutions to unemployment and social decline. Above all, they suggested that some lives were simply worth more than others. When the Nazi Party seized power in 1933, these ideas shifted from academic debate to enforceable policy. New laws targeted those deemed hereditarily diseased, forcing sterilization on thousands. Propaganda films and posters portrayed disabled people as drains on society, burdens on healthy taxpayers, and obstacles to national progress. The groundwork was being laid, quietly and methodically. Step by step, the regime was teaching its citizens and its doctors to view certain groups not as patients to be protected, but as problems to be solved. Meanwhile, in the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler was consolidating control over every facet of German life. According to surviving documents, one of the issues that came to his desk that year was a request from a German family with a severely disabled infant. The parents had written directly to Hitler, pleading for permission to end their child's suffering. Hitler consulted his personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt, who discreetly approved the killing. The act was illegal under existing law, but the act was carried out anyway. To Hitler, it demonstrated something important. Doctors were willing to obey him, even when the orders violated medical ethics and criminal statutes. In his mind, this opened the door to something much larger. By the summer of 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of war, Hitler signed a secret authorization granting Brandt and Reich Chancellery Chief Philipp Bühler full authority to initiate a program of mercy deaths. The letter was backdated to September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. Historians believe the date was chosen deliberately. The regime expected that during wartime drastic policies could hide behind the smoke of battle. The nation's attention would be elsewhere. And so the machinery of the T4 program began to assemble. The name T4 came from an unremarkable address in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. Behind that door, in an office that looked almost bureaucratic, coordinators mapped out the system. They established a network of psychiatric hospitals, special clinics, and killing centers disguised as medical facilities. They designed forms that would be sent to doctors across Germany, requiring them to evaluate patients with disabilities, mental illnesses, or chronic conditions. The forms did not request detailed medical reports. They did not ask for treatment histories. Instead, they asked for diagnoses, simple labels, often reduced to a single word: schizophrenia, epilepsy, feeble-mindedness, incurable. Each form went to a panel of physicians handpicked by the Nazi hierarchy. These doctors, most of whom never met the patients, marked the pages with red pencil. A red plus meant death. A blue minus meant life, for now. There was no appeal process, no legal oversight, no requirement for a second opinion. It was a system designed for speed and detachment. The fate of thousands was decided in minutes. While this administrative machinery expanded, preparations were underway at the killing centers themselves. Facilities such as Hadamar, Grafene, Brandenburg, and Hardheim were converted into factories of death. Buses with blacked-out windows were ordered. Chimneys were reinforced. Special chambers were constructed and sealed with heavy doors. The men tasked with building and operating the machinery were told to consider their work a patriotic duty, an act of cleansing the nation. Inside hospitals across Germany, nurses were instructed to prepare certain patients for transfer. Families were told that their loved ones were being moved to special treatment centers where they would receive better care. But as the buses rolled through small towns and rural villages, locals began to notice a pattern. People boarded the vehicles, but no one ever came back. Thick smoke rose from the chimneys at odd hours. Death notices arrived with suspicious regularity, often listing the same vague cause, pneumonia. Meanwhile, propaganda intensified. Films like Ich klage an portrayed euthanasia as compassionate, rational, even morally necessary. Posters displayed charts showing the supposed financial burden disabled people placed on healthy taxpayers. In classrooms, children were taught equations that valued human life as if it were a commodity. The goal was clear: make the unthinkable seem logical. Make murder look like medicine. By late 1939, the operation was fully underway. Trains and buses transported patients to the centers where they were undressed, examined briefly, and told they were being taken for a shower. Instead, carbon monoxide gas filled the sealed rooms. Doctors monitored the process through small windows, timing the deaths with stopwatches. Afterward, bodies were cremated and ashes were returned to families with standardized condolence letters. The entire process was designed to appear clinical, orderly, and efficient, as if these were simply medical procedures performed at scale. Yet beneath the surface, dissent began forming. Some clergy members, families, and even doctors questioned the morality of what they were witnessing. But protests were quiet, fragmented, and often dangerous. Nazi Germany was not a place where opposition thrived. And for the moment, the killing continued. As the program expanded, its targets broadened. According to historical records, not only adults, but thousands of children were now marked for death. Some babies were selected by midwives, others by local doctors, all based on criteria that grew increasingly vague. A diagnosis of uneducable could be a death sentence. The line between medicine and ideology blurred until it vanished entirely. By the end of 1940, the T4 program had become a streamlined operation, killing thousands each month. The regime believed it was perfecting a method that would shape the future of Germany. But what no one knew, not the doctors, not the families, not even the workers at Tiergenstrasse 4, was that the machinery being tested here would soon be expanded far beyond hospitals and clinics. It would follow armies into occupied territories. It would influence the construction of camps still being built in Poland, and it would evolve into something far more industrial, far more systematic, and far more devastating. For now, though, the world outside remained unaware. Buses continued to rumble down village roads. Smoke continued to rise, and behind closed doors, the architects of the program congratulated themselves on what they believed was a triumph of medical efficiency. But the illusion of secrecy would not last forever. A moment was coming when the truth would begin to surface, first in whispers, then in sermons, and finally in open defiance. It would challenge the foundations of the program and force the Nazi leadership to decide how far they were willing to go. The months following Hitler's secret authorization marked a chilling transformation inside Germany's medical system. Hospitals, clinics, and psychiatric institutions, once places of healing, slowly shifted into nodes of a vast bureaucratic machine designed to identify, sort, and eliminate people the regime deemed unfit. In the early days, nothing looked outwardly violent. There were no firing squads, no soldiers storming wards. Instead, letters, forms, questionnaires, files sliding across desks in Berlin offices. But beneath the paperwork lay the operational foundations of one of the earliest systematic mass murder programs of the Third Reich. Across Germany, physicians received forms requesting detailed information about their patients. These questionnaires didn't ask about personal stories, struggles, or progress. Instead, they demanded cold classifications. Could the patient work? Could they follow simple instructions? Were they disruptive? Did they require excessive food or supervision? Many doctors filled them out routinely, believing they were assisting research or improving institutional funding. Others understood exactly what they were contributing to and cooperated willingly. And yet the truth remained invisible to the public. No one outside a small circle in Hitler's chancellery knew that each marked box, each stroke of the pen, might determine who lived and who died. Meanwhile, a new organization quietly took shape inside the Tiergartenstrasse 4 villa in Berlin, officially referred to as the Reich Committee. It was in effect the headquarters of the Euthanasia Program. Young clerks, recruited not for medical knowledge but for loyalty and efficiency, spent their days reviewing thousands of forms. Behind them, senior doctors, men with prestigious titles, graduates from respected universities, made the final decisions. They sat in comfortable armchairs, red or blue pencil in hand. A cross meant death. A circle meant life. Sometimes they made these determinations in less than 10 seconds. They never saw the patients. They never heard their voices. To maintain secrecy, the program adopted layers of deception. Transport buses were painted gray, with windows blackened or covered with curtains. Staff wore no military insignia. When these buses arrived at institutions, patients were told they were being moved to specialized hospitals where they would receive better care. Many families believed it. After all, the Third Reich had mastered the art of disguising atrocities as medical progress. The public had already heard speeches promoting national rejuvenation, biological improvement, and the need to relieve families from the burden of incurable illness. The language of compassion masked the machinery of murder. Inside the killing centers, Brandenburg, Grafeneck, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, Hadamar, another transformation took place. These were not makeshift locations, they were deliberately chosen remote facilities converted with chilling precision. Buildings were renovated to include false shower rooms, airtight chambers, and crematorium ovens. Flowers were planted outside to make them resemble peaceful rural clinics. Even the staff cafeteria was positioned far from the killing wing, ensuring workers could have lunch without glimpsing smoke rising from the chimneys. The method chosen for mass killing, carbon monoxide gas, was selected after debates among the program's leadership. Shooting was too messy, too loud, too traumatic for personnel. Lethal injections were slow and required skilled hands. Gas, however, seemed clean, efficient, and, disturbingly, scientific. Engineers designed valves, pipes, and sealed doors. Doctors conducted clinical test runs to measure timing and ventilation. According to historical records, one physician later testified that he felt he was running a clinical experiment, not murdering human beings. Throughout the country, whispers began to emerge. Families received letters stating that their loved ones had passed away from pneumonia or suffered sudden heart failure. The documents were typed in sterile bureaucratic language, but something felt wrong. Children had been transferred only days earlier. Some families received ashes so hastily prepared that pieces of jewelry from other victims were mixed in. Priests and local leaders, especially in rural regions, quietly noted the rising pattern of deaths. People feared asking questions, yet the unease grew. Meanwhile, inside Germany's medical schools, something even chilling unfolded. Some professors began their lectures using materials, brains, organs, entire bodies taken from victims of the program. Students who raised concerns were told the specimens were donations. Few dared push further. Under dictatorship, silence became a survival tactic. The Third Reich framed the euthanasia program as an act of mercy, a step toward strengthening the nation. Yet behind the propaganda lay a profound betrayal of medicine's basic oath: do no harm. Doctors, trained to protect life, had become administrators of death. Many convinced themselves they were serving science or reducing suffering. Others acted out of ambition, loyalty, or fear. But regardless of motive, the line between healing and killing had vanished. As 1940 progressed, the machinery of T4 accelerated. Trains and buses moved constantly between institutions and killing centers. Clerks processed forms by the thousands. Crematorium chimneys burned day and night. And inside Tiergartenstrasse 4, officials celebrated efficiency targets as though discussing factory output. Yet not everyone remained silent. Across Germany, resistance began to form, quiet at first, then louder. Priests spoke from pulpits, nurses whispered warnings to families. Some doctors refused to sign forms. And soon the truth behind the gray buses and the sealed rooms would reach the highest levels of public outrage the regime had yet faced. But even as suspicion grew, the program did not slow. Its architects believed they were reshaping the future of the German people. They believed history would justify their actions. And by the time the first public outcry began, tens of thousands had already been killed. What happened next would not only challenge the Nazi leadership, it would reshape the entire trajectory of the euthanasia program. By the beginning of 1940, the euthanasia program had evolved from a bureaucratic initiative into a fully operational killing network. 6 main centers, Brandenburg, Grafeneck, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hadamar, formed the core of the operation. Each facility followed a carefully engineered sequence, refined through trial and error, meant to eliminate victims with maximum speed and minimum visibility. The entire system was built on a chilling balance, brutally efficient behind closed doors, eerily tranquil from the outside. At first glance, these centers did not resemble the industrial death camps that would appear later in the war. There were no guard towers, no barbed wire coils, no rows of prisoners lining up under the scrutiny of SS overseers. Instead, a visitor approaching Grafeneck or Sonnenstein might notice flower beds trimmed nicely along the path, or wooden signs pointing toward administrative offices. Inside courtyards, staff in white coats walked briskly between buildings. The air of a sanitary institution was deliberate. Everything from the painted doors to the quiet gardens was designed to conceal what occurred in the rear wings. Victims arrived in the now infamous gray buses, each one stripped of any markings that could reveal their purpose. The drivers acted with mechanical detachment, often refusing to meet the eyes of patients or institution staff. When the buses stopped at their destinations, attendants stepped forward to escort the passengers inside. They maintained a rehearsed tone of reassurance. "You will be examined first. Your room is being prepared. Everything is in order." Many victims, weakened by disability or illness, had no choice but to follow. Inside the reception rooms, clerks recorded each person's arrival. Photographs were taken, front profile, side profile, under the guise of medical documentation. This was one of the most disturbing layers of the program, the meticulous cataloging of individuals who would soon vanish. The records served two purposes. First, they allowed the bureaucracy to track its operations. Second, they provided scientific material for certain physicians who used these images in lectures, claiming they were studying hereditary defects. The victims were then directed to what appeared to be showers. These rooms were built to mimic ordinary bathing facilities, tiled walls, metal fixtures, drainage systems, but the doors sealed tightly from the outside, and the shower heads were mere decoys. A large motor or cylinder feeding carbon monoxide gas sat hidden behind a wall. Within moments of the doors being locked, the engine roared to life, and the lethal gas filled the chamber. Most victims died within minutes. The doctors overseeing the process monitored through small glass windows, not out of mercy, but to ensure the killings proceeded efficiently. After the chamber was cleared, workers, often chosen for their reliability or willingness to participate without question, removed the bodies. They extracted gold teeth, sorted clothing, and carried the corpses to the crematorium ovens. Ashes were collected into small urns, many of which never contained the remains of the correct individual. The administration simply lacked the time or interest to keep such details accurate. The priority was throughput, a system functioning with industrial precision. To maintain secrecy, the program relied on deception, not just within the walls of the killing centers, but throughout the entire Reich. Families were notified by official letters stating their loved ones had died from natural causes, usually pneumonia, heart failure, or a sudden complication. The letters often included forged medical records detailing treatments that never occurred. Some institutions even sent condolence notes written in gentle language, urging families to remember their relatives peacefully. But the dates, stories, and circumstances rarely made sense. Many victims had shown no such symptoms in the days before their transfer. Others had been moved far from home with no explanation. Suspicion spread. Clergy members were often the first to piece together the pattern. Priests noticed multiple funerals occurring in rapid succession. Parishioners whispered about the buses with covered windows. Some doctors, appalled by what they saw behind closed doors, discreetly warned families not to send relatives to particular institutions. In a few areas, the public began to confront local authorities directly. The regime took these signs seriously. They feared, above all, open outrage. But certain leaders inside the Nazi hierarchy remained confident. They believed the German public would ultimately understand. They framed the killings as a necessary step toward purifying the nation, reducing burdens, and allocating resources to the war effort. In speeches and propaganda pamphlets, the regime emphasized the economic argument, how much food, care, and medical attention were wasted on those who could never contribute. It was a cruel calculus, one that transformed human beings into numbers on a balance sheet. But inside the killing centers, how many workers could endure their roles? Some drank heavily. Others asked to be transferred after witnessing the gassing process. There were reports of staff breaking down in private, unable to reconcile their actions with their previous identities as healers, nurses, or caretakers. Yet the program continued. The machinery was too large, the directives too explicit, and the consequences of disobedience too uncertain. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, the T4 program intensified. Thousands more were transported across Germany and Austria. The crematoriums operated day and night. Administrators in Berlin measured success through quotas and charts, not through any moral lens. For them, it was a national project, a scientific mission, something they believed would shape the future of the German race. But beyond the quiet halls of the killing centers, a storm was building. Messages from desperate families reached local churches, rumors spread across towns and villages, and some of the most outspoken critics of the program were preparing to challenge the regime openly, defying one of the most fearsome governments in history. What followed would become a turning point, one the Nazi leadership had not anticipated. By mid-1941, cracks in the secrecy of the T4 program had widened into fissures the regime could no longer ignore. Ordinary Germans, housewives, farmers, factory workers, parishioners were beginning to whisper openly. Something was deeply wrong, something inhuman, something un-German even by the twisted definition of the era. In village markets and church courtyards, people spoke of the gray buses with sealed windows, the empty beds in hospitals, and the sudden deaths that followed the transfers to distant institutions. Families compared letters of condolence and realized they told the same story, almost word for word. The Nazi leadership had expected silence. They had not anticipated the power of community memory, especially in small towns where every resident knew every face. And they certainly had underestimated the moral authority of the church, one of the few institutions in Germany that still commanded genuine loyalty across all social classes. The most formidable opponent emerged from the Catholic hierarchy, Clemens August Graf von Galen, the Bishop of Münster. Known for his sharp intellect, uncompromising faith, and fiery sermons, von Galen was not a man easily intimidated. He had watched the Nazi government encroach on religious schools, seize church property, and harass clergy. But T4 was different. This was murder, plainly and indisputably, and for von Galen, silence was no longer an option. On August 3, 1941, he stood before a packed congregation in St. Lambert's Church and delivered one of the most dangerous sermons of the Third Reich. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings as he condemned the killings outright. Woe to mankind! Woe to our German people if the holy commandment of God, "Thou shalt not kill," is no longer respected. He spoke of patients dragged from institutions, of families who received ashes in urns without explanation, of rumors confirmed through undeniable evidence. He accused the government of committing crimes that violated both moral law and divine authority. The congregation erupted in shock, not only at the reality of what he described, but at the courage required to speak it aloud in Nazi Germany. Copies of the sermon circulated secretly across the country. Some were typed by resistance members, others were smuggled by clergy or passed hand to hand in factories. The word spread like wildfire, amplified by the whispered testimonies of mourning families. In many cities, church attendance surged. Priests read von Galen's sermon from their pulpits. The public murmured approval, outrage, fear. Hitler was furious. He demanded that von Galen be executed once the war was over, a chilling promise recorded in the diaries of several Nazi leaders. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, feared the bishop's death would ignite open rebellion in the Catholic-dominated regions of Westphalia. Heinrich Himmler argued that the timing was too dangerous. The war in the East was intensifying, and crushing morale at home could prove catastrophic. The German people might tolerate many things, but the image of the regime murdering the sick and disabled, then killing a bishop for denouncing it, was too volatile to risk. Thus, for the first time, the Nazi leadership was forced into a defensive retreat. In late August 1941, Hitler issued a secret directive ordering a halt to the euthanasia gassings. The gray buses stopped rolling. The engines in the gas chambers went quiet. At Hadamar, the staff received the order with visible relief. At Sonnenstein, administrators hurried to dismantle equipment. Crematoriums cooled. The T4 headquarters in Berlin slowed its operations. To the outside world, it appeared as though the protests had succeeded. Many families felt a fleeting sense of victory, believing their voices had saved future lives. Priests celebrated the power of moral courage. Even some Nazi regional officials were relieved, having never been fully comfortable with the program. But inside the regime, resentment smoldered. Hitler had not changed his mind. He had simply shifted tactics. Privately, he insisted that the killing of life unworthy of life must continue, just not in a manner that provoked public backlash. The program, he argued, needed to change its methods, become decentralized, and avoid the appearance of mass murder. And so, even as the formal gassing operations were suspended, the killings quietly resumed under a new structure. Doctors received instructions to use lethal injections instead of gas. Administrators were told to falsify medical charts showing sudden illnesses or natural declines. Hospitals were encouraged to implement what the Nazis called wild euthanasia, a loosely supervised continuation of the killings carried out at the discretion of individual physicians. Some facilities withheld food or medication. Others administered overdoses under the guise of treatment. According to historical records, up to 93,000 people were murdered after the official halt, more than the number killed during the peak of the organized T4 gassing phase. The horror continued, less visible, but no less lethal. Meanwhile, thousands of the personnel trained in T4, drivers, nurses, crematorium workers, even the doctors who had overseen the gas chambers, were reassigned. Many were transferred east to the newly established extermination camps in occupied Poland. Their experience made them valuable. They understood logistics, secrecy, and efficient killing. They had already proven their loyalty. It is no coincidence that several key figures in Operation Reinhardt, the plan to eliminate Polish Jewry, had previously served in the euthanasia centers. In this sense, T4 became the prototype for the Holocaust. The methods tested on Germany's most vulnerable citizens, mass transport, deception, gas chambers disguised as showers, cremation of bodies, falsified death certificates, were all refined during the euthanasia program before being scaled up into the machinery of genocide. Back in the towns and villages of Germany, however, few understood the full scope of what had happened. They knew people had died. They knew something foul had been stopped, but they did not realize the program had merely mutated. They did not know that its personnel were already en route to places like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, carrying with them the technical knowledge needed for the next, far greater catastrophe. The temporary halt was not a victory. It was the calm between storms. And as 1941 turned into 1942, the machinery of mass killing, now perfected, was preparing to unleash its full power across Europe. By the end of 1941, the T4 Euthanasia Program had officially been halted. The gas chambers in Germany stood silent, their pipes dismantled, and their windows bricked over. But to the men running the Third Reich, this was not an end. It was a pivot. The infrastructure, personnel, and philosophy that had driven T4 were about to be exported eastward, where secrecy was easier to maintain, and where the Nazi regime felt no need to hide its brutality. The lessons learned on the wards of psychiatric institutions were about to become the foundation of something far more ambitious and infinitely more lethal. In the shifting landscape of occupied Poland, newly conquered territories offered the Nazis a blank canvas, one where they could design spaces of murder without the prying eyes of the German public. In Berlin's highest offices, discussions intensified about the Jewish question. How to remove millions of Jews from the expanding Reich. Deportation schemes had been proposed: Madagascar, Siberia, or mass exile across Europe. But as war widened and logistical fantasies collapsed, the idea of permanent removal through homicide grew increasingly attractive to the leadership. Here, the T4 program provided a ready-made blueprint. The same men who had engineered efficient mass gassing and body disposal in German euthanasia centers were transferred to new killing grounds in the general government area of Poland. They brought not only their skills, but their ideological conditioning, the belief that mass murder was a form of sanitation, a necessary cleansing of the body politic. Their destination? Places like Helmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps would become the epicenters of Hitler's final solution, and at the heart of their development were the men shaped by T4. The transfer of expertise. The transition from euthanasia killings to genocidal extermination was shockingly smooth. Christian Wirth, a senior T4 officer who had overseen the construction and operation of gas chambers in Germany, was appointed inspector of the Operation Reinhardt death camps. His expertise was considered indispensable. Under his direction, construction crews built the camps using designs refined in T4 facilities: sealed chambers, disguised entry points, efficient airflow, and swift removal of bodies. Witnesses later described him as a man of cold efficiency, a technician of death. Other T4 veterans followed similar paths. Dr. Irmfried Eberl, former medical director at Brandenburg and Bernburg euthanasia centers, became the first commandant of Treblinka. His experience in processing large numbers of victims made him, in the eyes of Nazi leaders, the perfect candidate to oversee one of the deadliest camps of the Holocaust. He brought T4 procedures with him: mass deception, systematic intake processes, and the ruthless logic of throughput. This continuity reveals a chilling truth. The Holocaust did not emerge suddenly. It grew out of the administrative and psychological preparations honed in the euthanasia program. Murder had become a bureaucratic skill set. Philosophy becomes policy. Behind these administrative shifts was a philosophical evolution, or rather, its collapse. In T4 facilities, the victims were Germans, disabled, ill, or institutionalized citizens, whom the regime labeled burdens or unproductive. If these people could be eliminated without public revolt, at least temporarily, then what resistance could the Nazis expect when turning their methods toward populations already despised, dehumanized, or removed from mainstream German life? In Nazi ideology, eugenics and racism were intertwined threads. The disabled were viewed as biologically inferior, Jewish people as racially dangerous, and Slavic populations as expendable obstacles to Lebensraum. The logic of elimination, first practiced on the wards of German hospitals, expanded naturally into the broader genocidal vision. What began as killing defective life soon became killing unwanted life, then enemy life, until finally the entire machinery of the state was directed toward the destruction of entire peoples. Euthanasia methods shape the death camps. In the euthanasia centers, murder had been framed as a medical procedure, clean, clinical, hidden behind institutional architecture. In the camps, the killing became more industrial, more brutal, but the underlying principles remained the same. Gas chambers. The carbon monoxide gassing process used in T4 centers inspired the chambers at Belzec and Sobibor, though adaptations were made for larger numbers. Instead of bottled gas, diesel engines were modified to pump exhaust into sealed rooms. The goal was the same: murder en masse with minimal physical involvement from the perpetrators. Deception. Just as T4 used the ruse of treatment and transfers, the camps promised showers, disinfection, or resettlement. Victims were told to undress carefully, tie their shoes together, remember where they placed their belongings, anything to maintain calm and prevent resistance. Logistics. T4 personnel had mastered the efficient movement of bodies, paperwork, and ashes. In the camps, this experience translated into appalling speed. Trains arrived, victims were processed, murdered, and disposed of with a chilling rhythm that mirrored the euthanasia system, only magnified. Record-keeping. Death was documented, categorized, quantified. In T4, falsified reports masked the cause of death. In the camps, the paperwork became even more minimal, but the mindset remained. Victims were data, numbers to be processed, not human beings. Medical authority reborn in the East. In T4 institutions, doctors played God with life and death. In the East, many of these same doctors became silent collaborators or active participants in genocide. Some supervised selections, deciding who would be sent to labor camps and who would be sent straight to the gas chambers. Others observed the effects of starvation, disease, or exhaustion, continuing the pseudo-scientific obsessions that had begun in the euthanasia centers. The medical mask of legitimacy, once used to justify killing the disabled, now justified racial murder. It became easier for perpetrators to believe they were not butchers, but custodians of a new, healthy European order. The collapse of boundaries. By 1942, the boundaries between euthanasia and genocide had dissolved completely. Mobile gas vans, first tested on psychiatric patients in the East, became instruments of mass murder in places like Chelmno. The idea of killing those deemed unfit expanded into targeting entire families, entire communities, entire regions. The T4 program had been the rehearsal. Operation Reinhard was the full performance. Within just 2 years, the killing centers inspired by T4 methods would murder approximately 1.7 million Jewish men, women, and children, many of them within hours of arriving at the camps. Germany's forgotten victims. Ironically, as the machinery of genocide escalated, the disabled and ill within Germany continued to suffer under the shadows of wild euthanasia. Hospitals still administered overdoses. Institutions still withheld food. Children's wards still operated covert killing schemes. Although no longer centralized under the T4 headquarters, the spirit of the program lived on in thousands of quiet decisions made by doctors who had been ideologically reshaped by the euthanasia years. While the world's attention was drawn to the Eastern Front, Germany's most vulnerable continued to die behind closed doors. The machinery had shifted to a larger stage. The ideology had expanded beyond its original targets. And the personnel, trained in the art of killing through medical necessity, were now powering the deadliest genocide in human history. Yet, even as the industrial killing reached its peak, resistance was stirring again, this time not only among clergy or families, but among soldiers, bureaucrats, and even some perpetrators who began to whisper doubts. But the regime was not done. The darkest phase was still unfolding. When the war finally began turning against Japan in 1944, Unit 731 accelerated its experiments instead of shutting them down. Prisoners were injected with multiple pathogens at once: plague combined with typhus, anthrax combined with cholera, just to see which disease would kill faster. Many victims were tied near explosives laced with biological agents so researchers could observe infection through shrapnel wounds. Others were left outdoors in sub-zero temperatures until their flesh froze solid, then thawed, then refrozen again over and over, while doctors recorded every stage of tissue decay. No one inside the facility was considered a survivor. Even those who lived longer were simply subjects awaiting the next test. Some prisoners begged guards to end their suffering, but mercy was forbidden. A person was only sent for dissection or disposal once researchers believed they had extracted every last usable piece of data. In these final months, the cruelty became methodical, frantic, and stripped of any remaining pretense of science. Rumors began to spread among the prisoners that Japan was losing the war. For them, hope was dangerous. Anyone caught whispering about possible liberation was immediately removed for reassignment, a euphemism for execution or live experiments. As the Allies advanced, the atmosphere inside the compound grew tense and unpredictable. Experiment rooms ran day and night, and guards grew more violent, driven by fear of what might happen if their atrocities were uncovered. The horrors intensified because the researchers knew the clock was ticking. Every new infection, every forced freezing, every surgical violation was treated as one last chance to gather useful findings. Inside those walls, humanity became meaningless. And for the people trapped there, the end, whenever it came, was rarely a rescue. It was simply the final experiment. As Japan's defeat became inevitable in mid-1945, panic spread among the leaders of Unit 731. They understood that if Allied forces captured the facility intact, the world would witness the full scale of their crimes. Orders arrived from Tokyo: destroy everything: documents, evidence, and the prisoners themselves. What followed was a calculated, methodical effort to erase history. Researchers burned entire warehouses of records, some containing years of experiment data. Barrels of plague-infected fleas were dumped into furnaces, glass containers shattered, cages emptied and destroyed. Medical instruments were buried or melted. The buildings themselves were wired with explosives. But the darkest part of the cover-up was what happened to the remaining prisoners. Hundreds of captives, sick, injured, or still undergoing experiments, were loaded onto trucks under the guise of relocation. Instead, they were taken to remote fields and executed. Others were locked inside barracks that were doused in gasoline and set on fire. The goal was simple: leave no witnesses. Personnel who hesitated or questioned the orders were threatened with the same fate as the prisoners. In the rush to flee, the final experiments became even more brutal. Some doctors tested lethal chemical agents right up until evacuation day, desperate to conclude studies they had started. Those too weak to move were killed on the spot. The compound that had operated in secrecy for years was now collapsing in a frenzy of destruction and fear. When the Soviet army approached Manchuria, most of Unit 731's personnel vanished, disguised, reassigned, or quietly absorbed back into Japan's military and medical institutions. The facility itself was abandoned, its ruins still warm from the fires. To the outside world, it looked like a base hastily evacuated, but buried beneath the ashes were the traces of one of the most horrifying war crimes ever committed. When the war ended in August 1945, the ruins of Unit 731 stood silent on the outskirts of Harbin. The buildings were charred, the instruments melted, and the documents reduced to ash. But even in destruction, the truth had a way of resurfacing. As Soviet forces swept through Manchuria, they uncovered body pits, abandoned laboratories, and scorched operating rooms. The architecture of the crimes could still be read in the walls. Soviet investigators immediately recognized that what lay before them was no ordinary military research station. The rooms were too large, too sterile. Drainage channels lined the floors. Hooks hung from ceilings. The traces were unmistakable. This had been a place of systematic human experimentation. Meanwhile, in Japan, the scientists and doctors who had carried out the experiments returned quietly to civilian life. Some resumed prestigious careers, heading universities, medical boards, and research labs. Others found employment in government or industry. They blended back into society almost effortlessly, aided by the chaos of post-war reconstruction and by something far more controversial: American protection. According to declassified U.S. documents, American intelligence officers saw immense strategic value in the biological warfare data obtained by Unit 731. The Cold War had already begun to take shape, and the United States feared that the Soviet Union would seize the same knowledge. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, several former Unit 731 leaders provided their research findings to American officials. These findings had been extracted through torture, murder, and human experimentation, yet they were treated as valuable military assets. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted many Japanese war criminals, but Unit 731's leaders were conspicuously absent from the courtroom. The decision sparked controversy that still haunts international law today. Was strategic advantage allowed to outweigh justice for thousands of victims? For the families of those who vanished into Manchuria, the silence was devastating. Justice, however, did come partially from another direction. In 1949, the Soviets held the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, publicly revealing testimonies from Unit 731 members. Their confessions described vivisections, plague bomb tests, frostbite torture, and mass killings. Many in the West dismissed the trials at the time as propaganda, but decades later, declassified files confirmed that much of the testimony had been accurate. The truth had been spoken, just not believed. In the decades that followed, survivors, historians, and human rights advocates worked relentlessly to uncover the full scope of Unit 731's crimes. Former workers, driven by guilt or age, began to talk. Archaeologists unearthed remains near the old site, and Japanese activists pressured their government for official acknowledgement. While some museums and memorials now stand where the facility once operated, the struggle for full recognition continues. Today, the legacy of Unit 731 is not only a story of wartime horror, it's a warning. It reveals what happens when science is stripped of ethics, when medicine becomes an instrument of death, and when governments bury truth beneath political convenience. The victims, Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian, and others, never received proper compensation, and many families never learned the fate of their loved ones. Their absence remains a silent wound across East Asia. But their story endures. It is preserved by historians, taught in classrooms, spoken in memorial halls, and shared in documentaries like this one, because the darkest chapters of history must be remembered, not to dwell in cruelty, but to ensure it is never repeated.